The tent smelled of old grain and anxiety. Harold Godwinson, king for 8 frantic months, stared at a tally stick and a stack of empty sacks. The math was brutally simple, and I could feel the weight of it through every dusty fiber. The Fyrd, the army of free men who owed him service, had been chewing through the coast's provisions since June. Their legal clock had run out. The harvest was screaming from the fields, and the sea was mockingly empty. No Norman sails, so Harold made the most expensive administrative decision in English history. He let the army go home. Not because the war was over, but because the contract expired. If you've ever had to shut down a project because the budget line hit zero while the real threat was still circling, this moment should make your stomach drop. Let me rewind a few months because this wasn't a military blunder. It was a financial trap that closed one clause at a time. Edward the Confessor died in January 1066 without a clean heir. Harold, the richest earl in the land, grabbed the crown. The problem? 2 other men were also grabbing it in their minds. William, Duke of Normandy, insisted Edward had promised him the throne years ago. Harold Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway, had a dusty treaty that maybe gave him a claim. 3 men, 1 chair, and the only collateral was the grain still growing in the fields. Harold knew William would sail from the south, so he did the sensible thing. He called up the Fyrd and stationed them on the Channel coast, ready to swat the Normans. He also had a fleet. All summer, nothing. And that's when the ledger starts to whisper louder than the clanking armor. The Fyrd was not a standing army. It was a part-time militia deal. Free men owed the king about 40 days of military service per year, with their own weapons and a bag of their own food. After that, the king had to feed them from his own pocket, and Harold's pocket, while bulging with land deeds, was not stuffed with instant coin or teleporting wheat. The tax system was a giant barn, not a bank. The geld came in slowly, mostly in kind. There was no royal credit line, no overdraft. If you owned a kingdom of manors but couldn't turn a harvest into a marching army's supper in real time, you were illiquid. Not poor. Illiquid. That distinction is everything. By early September, the coastal shires were picked clean. The men's obligation was up. The harvest, the literal winter food supply, was rotting on the stalk. Every day a soldier held a spear was a day he wasn't holding a sickle. That's not a poetic metaphor. That's a calorie count that decided whether villages starved by February. Harold faced a brutal trade-off. Keep the ford and risk famine, desertion, or rebellion. Dismiss them and risk William landing the next morning. He chose the grain. I don't think he was stupid. I think he was cornered by his own rulebook. If he forced men to stay, they might just walk, and then nobody would ever show up again when the king called. The army's contract had expired, and there was no way to renew it without destroying the entire system of trust. So the order went out. The Fyrd melted back to their villages. The fleet sailed to London. The south coast of England became a very expensive welcome mat. William didn't need to beat the English army. He just needed to wait for its contract to expire. It's one of the cruelest commercial terms I've ever seen disguised as a military event. Then the second invoice landed. Harold Hardrada, dragging Harold's own salty exiled brother Tostig with him, stormed into the north with a massive Viking fleet. The message reached the king. Forget William. The real fight is up there. Harold did something genuinely stunning. He grabbed his household troops, the housecarls, scraped together whatever Fyrd men he could reach, and force-marched nearly 200 miles in a few days. He caught Hardrada completely by surprise at Stamford Bridge on September 25th and smashed him. Both Hardrada and Tostig died. On paper, a glorious victory. In reality, the bill for that triumph was printed on every gasping, hollowed-out soldier. The northern ford was bloodied. The harvest in the south was still half finished. The army was wrecked. And Harold was now 250 miles from the Channel, with a southern coast that had no army at all. The timing is so perfectly awful it feels scripted by a vengeful accountant. He beat a Viking king in the morning. By afternoon, the receipt for that victory read, "One drained army, one open back door. Glory is loud, but the invoice is silent and absolutely merciless." And guess who was watching that door? William had been stuck in port for weeks, waiting for the wind to change. But he was also waiting for something else. Intelligence. We can't prove he had a spy report, but the timing makes an economist squint until it hurts. The Fyrd disbanded around September 8th. Harold smashed Hardrada on the 25th. William sailed on the 27th or 28th, landing at Pevensey completely unopposed. No one was there. The coast was silent. I'm almost certain William got word that the English army had gone home, and the king was busy bleeding someone else up north. The information asymmetry was deadlier than any cavalry charge. Harold was operating on old data, dealing with a known threat in the north, while a smarter, faster bill was being drafted silently in the south. A breathless rider eventually found him. "William has landed." The map said, "Defend the coast." The messenger said, "Too late." The Normans didn't bring a better sword. They brought a contract that the other side had already been forced to break. Now the real race began. Harold yanked his shattered army south again. The elite housecarls marched with him, but the broader Fyrd was a scattered mess. Many men from distant shires couldn't be recalled in time. The northern earls, Morcar and Edwin, were slow to send their troops. Maybe they were exhausted too. Maybe they were hedging their political bets. Maybe they simply couldn't move faster. Watch the incentive. Always watch the incentive when the bill is due. Harold reached London with a much smaller force than he had at Stamford Bridge, and those men were running on empty stomachs and 3 weeks of blisters. He made a fateful choice: march to Hastings and fight William immediately, before the Normans could ravage the countryside and erode his own legitimacy. Some textbooks call it sunk cost fallacy, chasing a losing strategy because you've already invested so much. I call it a king with no good options, praying one desperate roll of the dice could reverse a cascading calendar disaster. He arrived at Hastings with the bill for every forced mile carved into his soldiers' faces. October 14th, 1066, Senlac Hill. Harold's shield wall locked into place, a dense line of axes and shields. It held for hours. William threw cavalry, archers, infantry at it. The Norman knights couldn't crack it. Then the feigned retreats began, drawing out the less disciplined Fyrdmen, breaking the wall's cohesion. The housecarls fought to the last. Harold fell, probably from an arrow to the eye, and then a final rush of knights. The shield wall crumbled. Now the traditional story blames a clever Norman trick, but the deeper truth is, uglier and much more boring. Harold's army was running on fumes. The fresh Norman knights had been sitting on ships eating preserved meat. The English axes were being swung by men who had walked the length of England twice in 3 weeks, on a calorie deficit, with farm work unfinished and dead friends still fresh in memory. This wasn't a battle. It was an endurance test with swords. William brought cavalry. Harold brought an expired contract and a sleep debt that no amount of courage could repay. The shield wall didn't break because it was poorly led. It broke because the muscles holding it were already broken. I find it hard to even blame the Fyrd men who chased the feigned retreat. Exhausted, hungry people do not make the same tactical calculations as well-fed ones. The Normans exploited biology, not just bravery. But the bill for 1066 didn't stop at the battlefield. William's coronation on Christmas Day was a chaotic mess. His own guards panicked and set fire to nearby buildings. The real long-term cost was quieter and far more permanent. Over the next 20 years, the Normans systematically redistributed nearly all English land to French-speaking lords. They built castles to extract obedience. They installed Norman abbots and bishops. And in 1086 they compiled the Domesday Book, a giant tax audit of every manor, pig, plough, and field in the kingdom. That book is not a census. It's a hostile takeover document, a ledger that recorded exactly who owned what before the conquest, and who owned it now, so the new regime could squeeze every possible penny of rent and tax. The short-term disbandment decision in that canvas tent led directly to a permanent repricing of an entire economy. Harold's estates were listed under new Norman owners. Reason for loss: see attached supply tent receipt. If you're looking for the root cause of England's property reset, the source document isn't a sword. It's an empty grain sack in September. Here's what I really need to sit with, and I think you should too. Harold Godwinson was not a fool. He was a competent, wealthy, battle-hardened leader who got trapped inside a system that couldn't stretch. The Fyrd was designed for a predictable war season, one crisis at a time, with a clear end date. 1066 gave him 2 invasions spaced almost exactly by the length of the Fyrd's own legal fuse. The liquidity crisis, the commitment problem, the information asymmetry, the brutal opportunity costs of the harvest. These weren't abstract concepts. They were the 4 walls of a prison that closed around him in September and didn't open until he was dead. The system said 40 days. The harvest said September. The invaders said 2 different months. And there was no bank, no credit, no flexible treasury to bridge the gap. The real conqueror of 1066 wasn't William's cavalry. It was a calendar. The battle was fought with swords, but the final bill was paid in land, pigs, and a 900-year receipt called the Domesday Book. Follow the receipt, and you'll see the crown didn't fall on a hill. It fell in a supply tent, surrounded by empty grain sacks, on a Tuesday, with interest.